You're listening to the Tank Magazine podcast. In this episode, Tank assistant editor Lily Owen Rowlands talks with the writer Edward Siddons about his essay, A Common Ear, which appeared in the Gossip issue. They discuss how gossip might open up the ways we understand LGBTQ history, the hypocrisy and morality of when the gossip site Gawker outed venture capitalist Peter Thiel, and what the fantastical hearsay surrounding the US's first FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, can tell us about how we historically conceived of sexuality and power. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Lily.
So you wrote a piece for our most recent Gossip issue of Tank about the possibility of using gossip as a kind of archaeological or historical tool within queer contexts. And so you start by calling gossip a queer patois, and you celebrate the way that it manages to speak the unspeakable, circulate kind of forbidden knowledge. It really becomes a kind of radical tool.
I think that the reason why I sort of consider gossip a queer patois is that, in the most literal sense, queer communities have made their own language in order to be able to speak. So if we're talking about 1950s London, we could consider the example of Polari, which to a sort of modern ear is almost incomprehensible, but was a way in which to discuss not only who'd fucked who, but who sort of was dating who knew who was going to which clubs, where one could go, where one hung out, where one sort of could go and congregate with other queers. And so I think the idea of gossip as a queer patois is the idea of this sort of intra-communal communication that solidifies a sense of identity that would otherwise not be possible because of the kinds of injunctions against speaking that existed for queer people in the past and still exist today.
It's really interesting when you explain how gossip has historically been used as a means to basically forcibly uncloset queers or to posit ideas about certain people's identities. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how that happened and the kind of history of the ways in which people are forcibly shamed.
So I suppose that one really important turn in the sort of history of outing people, in sort of tearing them from the closet, would have been the work in sort of the 80s and increasingly the 90s by Peter Tatchell at Outrage, and by people like Mike Signorile, who was a gossip columnist at Outweek, which is now defunct, and who was a member of ACT UP New York. Tatchell and Signorile essentially changed outing as a sort of hostile tactic by homophobic state structures or even just homophobic individuals, and turned it into a way to expose the sexuality of people in Congress, in the House of Representatives, or in the UK government, who were quite literally having sexual interactions with people of the same sex at the weekend, and then passing repressive and potentially lethal legislation on the Monday morning. And the way that it was justified was that it was about forcing these people to take responsibility for the hypocrisy that ran through their politics, and to essentially say that queers bash back and queers are not scared to go to these kinds of political extremes and to sort of, I suppose in some ways, break the sort of liberal consensus on the importance of privacy and one's private life and the sort of distinction between public and private, because essentially gay men had never really been afforded that. And so I think that this was a sort of key moment where outing stopped being the perennial fear, the constant sort of spectre haunting gay men at times or in places where they were not or could not be out in some sense. This is a real turning point at which this became a weapon for gay men's liberation rather than their oppression.
And it kind of continues now, because if you think about Peter Thiel, and there is a hypocrisy in his support and funding of operations like Facebook. I think he was one of the first investors, and his virulent denial, or at least silence, about the fact that he's gay. In the case of Peter Thiel, is it still okay to
forcibly out someone if the feeling is that there is hypocrisy at the heart of what they're doing.
I found the Peter Thiel and the sort of Hulk Hogan case and Gawker's outing of him really, really interesting, and really telling of various different kinds of fault line. In short, I think that the Peter Thiel case is difficult and does raise various ethical questions about sexuality and the public sphere in the 20th century, in a world in which there are still dangers coming out, but it's not the kind of potentially life-threatening change of status for people like Peter Thiel that it might have been in the past. And I think my essential take on it is that Gawker shouldn't have published that piece. They shouldn't have outed Peter Thiel because it didn't really serve any kind of public interest. It didn't serve any sort of broader political or ethical aims, and so they shouldn't have done that. But I do also think that the response to Peter Thiel has been quite astounding. And I sort of found it kind of infuriating, the way that certain sort of centrist and liberal gay media outlets sort of rallied around him of outing is never okay and outing never gets us anywhere. I mean, the question to me is, do you have any idea of the kind of role that outing has played in your history? Like, and I'm not saying that one should celebrate outing. I think it's an incredibly ugly tactic. But to claim this kind of pearl clutching outrage that somebody's been outed is, I think, to completely forget the sort of history of queer campaigning and queer politics by radical sort of fringe movements like ACT UP and like Outrage. And so the way that these sort of people came along and said, like, this is his sexuality, it is completely private to him, he has a right to privacy, I just sort of felt kind of astounded that there was no sort of critical engagement with the kinds of politics that he was espousing. The fact that he's backing the most dangerous demagogue that the United States presidency has ever seen. That there was just this sort of retreat to, no matter what you think of his politics, it's still not okay to out him. And it's like, well, actually, no. When his politics are distinctly contributing to a regime that will actively harm queer lives, and particularly queer lives of people of colour.
I don't feel sorry for him because he's really rich. He has thoroughly problematic politics. You know, I agree, Gawker shouldn't have published that piece, but you're right. He doesn't occupy the kind of precarious position that puts certain queer lives in danger. Yeah. It's like everything he advocates, I basically disagree with. And he doesn't assume the responsibility of furthering any queer cause. You talked just now about reclaiming gossip and reclaiming outing. And in the piece you write about how in histories of oppression, or at least among certain communities, that historicising one's struggle quite often relies upon having a distinct bloodline or distinct folkloric tradition, which is obviously not possible for queer communities. So I wonder if you could talk about how you explain gossip as a queer archaeological tool.
So I think one of the things that always interests me is the kinds of points of difference and similarity between different minority identities. And I think that one of the things that I think is quite distinct about being LGBT or being in some way queer is the idea that the family is not the kind of protective bubble from broader structures of, say, for example, racism or Islamophobia or anything like that, but that the family itself becomes a kind of site of danger in some respects, that the family is sort of exactly the thing that you cannot have, that you cannot sort of reach back through, and exactly a kind of nuclear model that will be politicized against you in later life to sort of prove the sort of decadence and hedonism and ultimate meaningless of your existence as a queer person. And I think that was one of the reasons why I think that gossip is so important, and I'm sort of taking gossip there in a broader sense of oral history, I guess. The sense that your family won't be able to provide those kinds of oral histories or those kinds of sort of first-hand popular knowledges or demotic knowledges of your sexual or gender identity, but that in some way, by having some kind of intergenerational communication, by actually getting some kind of queer community centre where queers are, like millennial queers, can speak to older queers who've survived the AIDS crisis or even survived the earlier fight for decriminalisation. That, I think, is the way in which gossip is an important historical tool, because gossip can give you less a sort of factual summary of repressive structures and laws that were written against you, and more of a kind of earthy, textured, almost kind of sensual kind of knowledge for what it actually meant to live in a certain period, and as such to sort of construct a sense of how that's changed, a sense of whether we might rejoice or kind of mourn for the fact that's changed, and all those kinds of things. So I suppose the reason why I think that gossip is so interesting is this kind of extra texture that it provides, and that it can give you things that have been erased from sort of mainstream history books, or things that have been misconstrued, or things that have just been forgotten. I mean, like, I find it quite astounding that young gay men and trans people, and essentially people across the queer spectrum, don't really seem to have any sense of the kind of immense knowledge that was lost by virtue of the AIDS crisis. And that in some way gossip might be one way to start reconstructing this mass death and extermination on this absolutely monumental scale.
Yeah, and I think in its purest sense, it gives you also an idea about the ways that people constructed their identity. Because as you say in the piece, the concrete terms that we think of now as broadly representing a vast spectrum of different types of identity, those terms probably and almost certainly were not in the common parlance.
Yeah.
And so this kind of gossip is really illuminating in thinking about the types of sexuality that existed at a certain time.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I think it's really interesting to pay attention to the sort of like specific forms that the gossip takes. Referring to somebody as a dyke rather than a lesbian is not purely a case of, or is not always a case of degradation. I mean, like, the history of dyke self-expression, so like the movement Dykes on Bikes, and the various kinds of ways in which lesbians have subverted or pastiched or parodied femininity and masculinity and the kind of gender binary more broadly. I think that understanding of that kind of political resistance, political action, can come from sort of understanding the different kinds of terms that were used at given moments. And I think that one of the things that's interesting as well is that when you look into the past and you look at gossip, these terms were often loaded in some respect with judgment or with condemnation. However, the way that they get sort of re-signified by queer communities is precisely what gives them such a rich history. And I question whether, if in 50 years' time people are looking back at the kind of alphabet soup that I talk about in the piece, this sort of ever elongating list of sexual identities or gender identities, I sort of wonder how that'll look in the future, because part of me feels that while of course it's important that people can claim some degree of autonomy over their identity and can inhabit a label that is free from shame and that is free from judgment, and that they feel that they can sort of claim as their own, I sort of question whether that doesn't in some way whitewash the history, whether it doesn't in fact remove the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, sort of repression and shame and various kinds of feelings are actually constitutive conditions of growing up queer in the current world. And I sort of question whether in 50 years' time, looking at official LGBT campaigns by Stonewall, or on the other hand movements like LGBT Tory, are necessarily going to be things that provide a particularly rich or textured or kind of holistic way into what it means to be queer at the present time. And so I suppose in a very roundabout way, what I'm saying is that I think that the kind of vernacular and the kind of gossip that circulates between people within the community is a much richer historical resource than the increasingly state-sanctioned, discrete, separate and definable identities that the LGBT community seems to be working towards.
Yeah, I think there's a power in naming, obviously. There's a power in naming, but can there be infinite categories and can there be infinite identities? I can imagine a time with the very possibility of reclaiming a word like queer would seem totally inappropriate. Knowing who you are is so important. But we do live in a time right now, I think, where maybe that's overtaken other things.
Well, I would agree with that, and I think that this kind of obsession with names I find really quite strange, because I think that people sort of use these names, and especially when it comes to sort of this idea of like reclamation, people seem to assume that one can just take a word that was an insult and refashion it as my own and then it's fine, and that it in some way completely reverses the original sort of sense of that. And I think that's actually a really simplistic way to look at these things. I mean, the reason why the resignification of the word queer has been so useful and so important in kind of theoretical, philosophical and kind of political sort of activist circles is that queer does not signify an identity in some respect. There's a brilliant quote from Towards a Gay Hagiography by David Halperin, I think, where he says, in the sort of most famous formulation of what queer means, that queer is not a sort of identity, it's identity without an essence. The idea that queer is in some way purely a kind of positionality with regards to a mainstream dominant discourse, sort of primarily sexual and gendered discourse. And then in fact it doesn't denote anything that has this kind of substantive weight or content that ties you to anything or ties you to an identity. The whole sort of point of queer was precisely a move away from the identity politics of gay and lesbian campaigning that sought to separate people into increasingly strictured boxes. And this was something that was really problematised around the AIDS crisis, insofar as AIDS didn't care whether you were a gay man or a bisexual man. Basically, AIDS didn't care for those kinds of sexual labels. It didn't care as to how you identified. HIV/AIDS cared about the kinds of sex one was having, and therefore there was a concerted move within sort of health campaigning and queer campaigners to move away from this identity-based model of understanding queer sex, and this move from distinguishing gay men and instead focusing on men who have sex with men. It sort of returns to this practice-based idea, and so for me that is what queer is, and so I kind of, I'm not sure there's necessarily a need to take sides in the sort of proliferation of separate identities or the sort of positing of a queer catch-all. But I think in some sense, I think that the latter is kind of preferable. I think that it is in some ways more amorphous, less sort of, I suppose, atomising and individualising.
You talk about J. Edgar Hoover and the hypocrisy at the heart of his possible queerness, and the way in which Susan Rosenthal sort of outed him in this, what is obviously totally bizarre anecdote about a bisexual orgy, an LBD, and a feather boa.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a tiny bit about what happened there, and then maybe we can talk a bit more about the gossip surrounding that.
So the Rosenthal allegations have sort of blown up at various points in history, in various kinds of biography, and every time they've been sort of tested as historical resources, they've sort of been tested for consistency and validity and what kind of purposes she might have disclosed the allegations for. And I think to do that is fundamentally to completely misread what the allegations were. I mean, the allegations were literally that she had been invited to this huge bisexual orgy by her husband, that she had gone along because she was curious, and that she had then seen the director of the FBI in this frilly dress, and I think, if I remember the story correctly, perhaps wearing gloves, or perhaps he made the younger men wear gloves.
There was leather.
And there were also hand jobs, and there were also blowjobs. And it's just this utterly fantastic story that recycles so many tropes from the sort of 50s, 60s and 70s. This idea that the gay man is necessarily the transvestite, and that the gay man / transvestite is necessarily in some way into
bondage.
But also these bizarre sexual practices where
there is actually no sex.
No.
I mean, there's sexual acts, weirdly more leather than sex.
More leather than sex, but also there's that sort of curious bit where I think one of them is I can't remember the story now, but I think one of them is reading from some kind of text. I don't know whether it's like a text of the Constitution or maybe a Bible, or there's some kind of act of reading involved as well.
Often happens
While you're getting a hand shanded.
particularly with politicians.
Yeah. Talk about foreplay. But it is this utterly fantastic story, and to kind of read it as was or was not this man a homosexual is, I think, to completely misread the terms in which it's expressed, and to completely sort of misread the things that it can tell us. And I think that Claire Potter's essay, which I draw on heavily in my piece, is really excellent at kind of analysing the ways in which the Rosensteel story does tell us far more about power than it does about the discrete sexual identity of one man. It tells us far more about the kinds of things that are taboo, the kinds of things that are associated with queerness in the public imaginary. And I think that's why it's useful. And I think Claire Potter does an excellent job of bringing out precisely the kinds of queer uses to which that kind of utterly absurd gossip can be put.
Yeah, and I think the overarching point of your essay is really to say it's not that useful to go back in history and add all these names to a big list of like gay man, lesbian woman.
Yeah.
And much more useful to use gossip to think about how we construct the public imaginary and how people constructed their sexual identity, and how gossip is this like brilliant liquid way of understanding those things and the way those things were constructed. And you say that it's one that can tell it, or at least I think you borrow from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick when she says that gossip makes us think about types of people, types of sexualities circulating at any one time. And you finish with the point that, and I think it's a point really well made, you say that taking gossip seriously is not equivalent to taking gossip as serious.
Yeah.
I just thought maybe we could finish with you unpicking that.
I think to take gossip seriously is to give it the time, attention, and sort of probing that it deserves. It's not to dismiss it immediately as just gossip, as just hearsay, as some kind of degraded and sort of rapidly degrading kind of knowledge. The more sort of mouths it passes through, the sort of dirtier or the less substantial it becomes. I think in that sense, to take gossip seriously is to give it the attention and to give it the kind of, and to assess it on its own terms in some respects. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about gossip, particularly now, is not the sense that it's some kind of exceptionally precarious form of knowledge that is exceptionally unstable and that is in some way an aberration to a body of knowledge that is clean, that is parsable, that is comprehensible. But that in fact what the encounter with gossip teaches you is precisely the degree to which, at the moment at least, all kinds of knowledge, and particularly political knowledge, are precarious. And this is one of the things that I found incredibly sort of interesting throughout the Brexit debates. This sort of clamouring by ordinary people for the facts, in huge scare quotes. Where are the facts? Give us the facts. I know you have them. I think the objection was right. I think there was a lot of obfuscation by both sides throughout the whole debate, and I thought in general it was a damning indictment on the state of British political culture, not just because of the result, but because of the way it was conducted. This idea that there are these facts, and we just need to go and sort of uncover them in some kind of bizarre treasure hunt fashion, or we need to extract them from the politicians, is a really dangerous way of looking at knowledge, because I think that if you assume there is this kind of clean, pure knowledge to be found in a kind of easy sense, when you're denied that, you then immediately turn to conspiracy. And I think that one of the things that gossip does, and what sort of treating gossip seriously, if not as serious, does, is to show the kinds of way in which almost all forms of knowledge are in some way constructed, that they always have these kinds of fissures, or these kinds of cracks, or these sort of points of weakness. And what I would hope gossip could do, and a sort of greater attention to gossip, is make people more attentive and understand and appreciate the sort of contingency of a lot of different kinds of knowledges.
to hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe through the iTunes Store. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.